Hi, everybody, and Shavua Tov. Welcome to those who are joining us for the first time, because today we have a special Passover themed week of learning, and all of our classes are dedicated to preparing in a very kind of practical way knowledge for the upcoming holiday Passover, which takes a lot of knowledge, but also preparing spiritually to get into that consciousness, which is so central. Whatever Passover is about, that's Judaism. Like, it's so central to our whole. It's where we start, right? It is. I think I would say, like, indisputably the most important Jewish holiday. Okay, so what is this class about? Now, it's about the Haggadah. The thing that we talk about, read about. Haggadah is obviously a reference to the book, but it's also, the word Haggadah means the telling, the storytelling. Haggadah, Magid, is the telling of the story. In the Talmud, we refer to the great stories as Agadah. So that's just like the general idea of telling the story of Passover. And we do it with this book. And we shouldn't do it with this book, because that's not telling a story. We're like, what we should be doing is trying to tell an actual story. Okay, now, but what are you going to do? Like, the Haggadah is a classic. It's a classic. So we read through the Haggadah. Now, the Haggadah is a classic, but it is a very strange little booklet. I mean, it doesn't, just as a read, it doesn't make any it's so disorderly and jumbled, and it doesn't, a lot parts of it seem overdone, and parts of it seem underdone, and it doesn't really make any sense as an assembly. But one of the things that this group, if you're with us regularly, has seized on to is the Mishnah as a source of like foundational, fundamental Jewish knowledge. The Mishnah, the code that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi compiled in the year 220, is, I think, the best place to go to start just sort of like getting to the bottom of this very this religion, which often feels like the Haggadah, just like it's jumbled and it's hard to understand, and it's dense, and there are references we don't. The Mishnah is really where it's the first conversation of putting together the Judaism that we know today, the Judaism that had to be constructed after the temple fell in Jerusalem. So it's to the Mishnah that we turn for basic core nuts and bolts Jewish knowledge. I think that's a general word to the wise. And it turns out that for the Haggadah, the Mishnah is the best place to look to get a sense of how this book came to be. Okay, so that's just by way of introduction. Let's now say a blessing together, just to bring some holiness into our learning space. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so I introduced the concept of the Haggadah. Now I just want to introduce our text for the day before I open up the conversation. And I must say, I want to really open up this conversation, because I didn't, I purposely, it's on purpose, don't worry. I purposely did not prepare too much for this class, because I have some basic questions I want to ask, and I don't have these great, neat and tidy answers at the end. I want us to together see if we can come up to some logic to one of the key teachings in the Haggadah itself that emerges from the Mishnah. Now, where are we? What's the, I said what the Mishnah is, but where are we? So we're in the volume of the Mishnah known as Psachim, the Passover volume. And last week, if you were with us, we looked at the opening of that volume, and it's 10 chapters long. So we looked at the first chapter. Now, all of those chapters deal with the laws, the rites and rituals and sacrifices and observances of Passover. But when you come to the last chapter, the 10th chapter, which is called Arvei Psachim, that is where we start to get into the Haggadah. And it's this chapter that we're going to look at today is an absolute classic, one of the most studied chapters in all of the Talmud. The Talmud is the elaboration of the Mishnah. And it's really here in the Mishnah that we see, why don't I just show you? You can see just how classic this is as we get into immediately a discussion of that night, that Passover night that we all know about, that is so familiar to us. Okay. This is the source sheet we're going to look at today. Okay. I see a note about captions. Are there captions? I think there are captions. Yes, there are. Okay. Okay. So let's take a look. We're gonna get, if you even read a description, we're gonna get down and gonna be considering today one core teaching of Rabban Gamliel's, who said that there are three essential things that one needs to cover during the Passover Seder. Okay, so we're heading there, but I just want you to have a feel for how we get there, how this chapter builds us into the first picture that we have in Jewish recorded tradition of what the Seder is supposed to look at. So here's the classic chapter, chapter 10, and it begins Arvei Psachim, Samuch Lemincha. Arvei Psachim, meaning on the eve of Passover. By the way, this is an aside, but if you were with us last week, you may hear an echo here because the opening chapter began speaking about the evening before Passover, and there's a kind of bookend here with the last chapter saying on the eve of Passover. Okay, so on the eve of Passover, when it gets adjacent to Mincha time, meaning in the afternoon, a person may not eat until dark. And all of this, I didn't translate these opening texts because we're not going to focus on them. All of this is like Rabbi Steinsaltz filling it in, and he gives us the reason so that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. Okay, so the very first line there is just we open on that night and we get a law. Don't eat anything from afternoon until it gets dark. Okay, that we're not there yet, and we're not into the Seder, but we're sort of, sun is setting and Passover is coming upon us, so stop eating. And then pretty quickly we get into something that looks to us like a Seder. Even the poorest of Jews, afilu anish b'Yisrael, should not eat the meat until he reclines on his left side, and the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine. Okay, there it is. With the 4 cups of wine, we are starting to see something we recognize. Oh, 4 cups of wine. That's Passover. That's the Seder. That's the Seder. Now, meaning the Torah doesn't mention 4 cups of wine. This is like the rabbinic text which begins to construct the Haggadah. Okay, so there's the 4 cups of wine, and if we start scrolling through to the next Mishnah, you can see that they essentially use those 4 cups as kind of marking points for the journey through the meal. So they pour the first cup of wine, and you say Kiddush, fine. Then they start talking about, now we're really, by Mishnah 3, it's really starting to look like a Seder. They bring out the vegetables, and there's the chazeret, and there's the charoset. Oh, there's matzah. Okay, we're eating matzah. Chazeret, charoset, and then finally the Pesach itself, gufo shel Pesach, the Paschal Lamb itself. So now we've got kind of we've got a structure. It's going to be structured on these 4 cups of wine, and we're starting to introduce the substances, the elements, the foods of the meal that night. Okay, so let's keep going because the next Mishnah begins to get us into the really juicy stuff, the telling of the story, because when we pour the second cup, then we speak about children asking his father, and if the son doesn't have the intelligence, why is this night different from all other nights? There's that language that is so familiar. Ma nishtana halayla hazeh. Why is this night different from all other nights? This is the source, okay? So if nothing else, if we're just sort of sourcing the Haggadah, Ma nishtana comes from Mishnah Psachim 10:4, okay? And you can see as they move through all of the various things that you say to the children who ask. So that's it. That's the beginning of the Magid. And it establishes for us the question and answer nature of the Seder. And it's kind of like, there's something ironic about that, right? Because we're supposed to provoke a spirit of questioning, and then very quickly it gets scripted so that the questions you ask are predetermined and the answers given are predetermined. And, in my opinion, the whole Seder goes downhill from there, right? Like, because it really, I can't say this enough, but it really, like, you should put down your Haggadot. When you get to the Magid section, put down your Haggadot and just start asking, like, well, what's the story? How can we do, what was the Egypt story, and do your best at it. That would be, I recommend it to everybody emphatically, but we still have to understand the Haggadah. So here we are in the Haggadah, and we're getting a little bit of the script, and then, and this is now we've reached the text that we're going to be analyzing today. In the 5th Mishnah, suddenly we get a teaching from Rabban Gamliel, and to my mind, it's a very helpful teaching, because Rabban Gamliel seems to be saying, okay, you're going to tell the story of Passover, fine. Just make sure you do at least, there's so many ways to tell a story. Tell it as you will, but make sure you do these things. And this is what I've like titled the class after. This is what I would consider Rabban Gamliel to be teaching us, is the essence, the IKAR, the basic, the core of Passover. So I'm encouraging you to put down the Haggadah and tell the story, but Rabban Gamliel wants you to do that with just the asterisk in mind that you have to make sure to cover these 3 points. And here they are. Okay? And this is what we're going to be talking about today. So what will Rabbi Kasher send in a moment? Did I not send it? Oh, I sent it.
The link just didn't come through.
I sent it only to my mom because she had chatted me. Hold on. Okay. Sorry, I didn't see that. Okay, that's the source sheet. So sorry. Okay, great. So here we go. Let's take a look now at the 5th Mishnah. And this one I actually did translate, so it'll be a little bit cleaner for us. Okay. Okay, here he is, Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel, we've encountered him before. He was sort of the nasi, the person who was in the most senior position in the rabbinic court. So he was a bit of a, I don't know if he was a bully, but he was a control freak. Like, he really was all about telling you what to do. And so here he is telling you what to do. Okay, Rabban Gamliel Omer, anyone who did not say these 3 things on Passover has not fulfilled their obligation. Pesach, matzah, and maror. Okay, here it is in Hebrew. Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer, kol shelo amar, anyone who didn't say shlosha davarim, 3 things, shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach, these 3 things on Passover, lo yatsa yedei chovato, has not fulfilled their obligation. And they are, and here I'll just highlight them, Pesach, matzah, and maror. Pesach, the Paschal Lamb. Matzah, that's the one I don't have to translate, right? Because matzah, that's the word we have for it. And then maror, the bitter herbs. Okay, so this basically is all we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes. Pesach, matzah, and maror. Lamb, that crispy bread, and bitter herbs. That, Rabban Gamliel says, although he says it in a kind of a funny way, those are the 3 things you have to say on Passover or talk about on Passover. Okay? And if that is already something to consider, but Rabban Gamliel gives us reasons. Okay, Rabban Gamliel gives us reasons why you have to talk about these things. And the reasons are Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, because the ever-present, this is like a big way to translate an unusual kind of word that we use for God, hamakom, which means the place. So because the ever-present passed over, and this is the same language, Pasach. This is where we get the language of Passover. Pasach, God passed over the houses of our ancestors in Egypt, okay? And I think we have some sense of that story, right? Like you put the lamb's blood on the door, and right, we've seen maybe a movie version of it where some green cloud sweeps through during the last plague of the killing of the firstborn, and all the firstborn sons will die. But if you've got the lamb's blood, I don't know, somehow God or the green cloud says, oh, you're fine then, and won't attack. So that's the passing over. Okay, that's one. Then there's the matzah. Why matzah? And I said, I'm not even sure what verb to use. Why do we eat matzah, or why do we talk about matzah? Because remember, Rabban Gamliel said, anyone who did not say these three things on Passover, shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu b'Pesach. So it's not, we talked about the eating already. There's something about talking about them that Rabban Gamliel insists on. So matzah, because our ancestors were redeemed in Egypt. Okay, well, now that's a good one. I mean, al shum shenig alu avotenu mitzrayim. Get this language right here of redemption, geula. That's the central theme, I suppose, redemption. So matzah because of redemption. And then maror, the bitter herb, you'll not be surprised, because the Egyptians embittered our ancestors' lives in Egypt. Al shum she miraru hamitzrim. So in this case, it's like a direct play on we eat bitter because they bittered us. All right. Okay. All right. So that's it. That's what we have to figure out together today. Why these three things? And let me begin by asking it this way. Why the Passover lamb? Like, okay, I get the matzah thing. Matzah is the central substance of the holiday. You got to explain that. And the reason for matzah is we were redeemed. I mean, that's all you need, right? Make sure you eat the matzah and say that we were redeemed. That's the whole holiday, geula. So matzah, I get that. And like, okay, if you want to throw in the bitter herbs, maybe I get that too. I think you could just do with matzah. But if you want to throw in the bitter herbs, then it's like, okay, maybe there's one thing that's good, we were redeemed, but don't forget it was also really hard, good and bad, right? Maybe that would be a logic. But the first thing is in memory of the fact that during the 10th plague, God passed over, and the truth is, that's what the holiday's named after. And that in itself really is my question. Why is that such a big deal that, like, it is a miracle. It is the last plague. I get why it's important in the story, but there are three things, and one of them is redemption. Stop there. And the third one is in the bitterness of the experience. Okay, I get that that's a general theme, but the passing over, like, why is that important? Why is that one of the first of the three? Okay, so let's just start there, and I hope that by the end of our time together, this group is full of brilliant minds, and hopefully we will be able to come together up with some kind of logic to this kind of formula, this essence that's boiled down to three elements of the Seder. Okay, Payam, Emrani, will you start us off?
Agency. I think the reason Passover starts with that is to say that the miracles require our input. If you look at all the different miracles that happened in the desert, the Red Sea parts because Nashon dives headfirst into the water. It just shows that God doesn't only do miracles because of God. We have to have an input into it. And I think agency is the key to Passover, and almost our entire religion is agency.
Okay. This is good. So Payam suggests that what's critical about the actual Passover moment, that last plague, is that you had to do something in order to experience the miracle. You had to paint your door with lamb's blood. That wasn't true for all of the other plagues, right? Things just sort of came up, like frogs coming out of the Nile, or it goes dark. But here in this last plague, you have to do something about it. And let's just take a look, because Payam gives us one way of thinking about the importance of that ritual. Let's just take a look at how it appears in the Torah itself. Right? There's a whole thing. Moses summons all of the elders and says, you go get lambs, you take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in blood, then you put the blood on the door. Then Moses describes when God goes out to smite the Egyptians, God will see the blood, and the Eternal will pass over the door, and et cetera, et cetera. So Payam's right. There's a kind of there's preparation. Like, you need to get involved. Okay, that's all right. So that's a good first answer. Yonatan?
So actually, building specifically off what Payam said, I think the matzah and the Pesach are two complementary, if not opposite, facets of agency, which is in the 14 days that we prepared for the Pesach, we had the time to bake leavened bread, but we didn't, right? So the people did exactly what they were told to do for their own liberation, but they didn't do any more. It was almost like they didn't realize, like they hadn't really internalized the fact that they were really leaving. And the fact that those two things combined to give us redemption is what, like, I think really is distilled in these three elements.
Okay, that's interesting. In other words, if I understand you correctly, Yonatan, there's a way in which the Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, reminds us of the things we did to prepare, and the matzah almost reminds us of the way that we weren't prepared at all, that we just were ushered along or sort of hurried out in the moment. Yeah.
Right. We followed the recipe to a T, but we didn't see ourselves as free people until after we actually left.
Okay. All right. Jamie Weissman, nice to see you.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Or not see you, as the case may be. Yes. Hello.
Hi. I'm driving, so trying to be as safe as I can. It's occurred to me in the last couple of years that there's like a randomness to this, to the what's it called? I'm forgetting the term for it. No, sorry. The punishment, the plague. The plague. Sorry.
Makot.
Yes, the plague. That's really all of the firstborn in the land should die. They would, if it weren't for the blood painted over their doors. It makes me think of like somewhere in the Talmud or some oral tradition that the Jews were in like the 50th rung of sin, or the 49th rung of sin in Egypt. And so they had reached this point where they didn't really deserve redemption. And so there's something to the Paschal sacrifice that is, I don't know how to finish the idea, but
I love the idea.
Yeah, a reminder that our very lives were just saved by one little stroke of blood. That's something like that.
Okay, that's a wonderful, very profound answer. The Pesach, says Jamie, represents a certain kind of awareness that we were spared, and there's no real reason why we didn't deserve to be spared. There's a kind of, when a plague, and we know this well, do we not? When a plague is raging throughout the land and your household is spared, you have to acknowledge that you have no control and you are just lucky to be alive, and but for the grace of God you would not be alive. And that whole orientation, gratitude, a sense of humility, an awareness of the others who suffered when you were spared, like all of that sense of the magnitude of God, essentially, and God's God and the way that God feels like fate sometimes, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we survived, and we had, in some ways this is a different answer. It's like we had nothing to do with it, really, but for a little blood on the door. All right, that's a really, Jamie has turned a moment of passing over into a whole religious orientation, a way of thinking about one's place in the universe with respect to the universe, with respect to God. Okay. All right, so that's good. Let's keep going. Alexandra?
My point jumps on the back of Jamie's point and your point about Jamie's point, which is that if we were redeemed, but we also were, this was so clear in my head a minute ago. We were spared, but now we have to be purposeful, and now we have to redeem ourselves to be worthy of having been passed over. And how are we going to make this count? How are we going to be worthy of what Jamie said and what you said?
Yeah, I like that. I like that build, because exactly what Jamie said, that experience, that awareness of the good fortune, the grace, the kind of incomprehensible luck or favor or kindness of God that allowed you to survive, should lead you to a sense of, what any near-death experience should lead you to, which is awareness of the preciousness of life and what one has to do with it, right? Like, oh my goodness, we survived. We better make something of this. We better commit ourselves to something. This leads us to Torah and the covenant and the whole thing. Okay, Matt Silverstein.
I want to start off saying Maggie also put this in the chat, and so we both had the idea. But this thing critical here is the blood, and again, blood is so important in the Torah. It is so powerful. We have so many rules about touching blood. I mean, it's kind of amazing that they're able to put the blood up there and not have to now separate themselves when we're going to get that rule in a little while. And the blood is the sacrifice that will be the temple, will be full of, so it's connecting us to a sort of the Judaism that we no longer have, that we don't do, and they're starting off with. And I think that's one of the things that he's saying there is, let us remember that. Let us pull that stuff in. We're not doing that anymore, but let's pull that into this ceremony.
Okay, thanks, Matt. That Matt offers us, I think, a different paradigm, and another important paradigm for thinking about the significance of this first substance, the Pesach, which is that, Matt takes us back to the blood of the door. Yeah, it functions a certain way in the actual plague, but blood, Matt says, is very important, and it's true. There, I was just at a bris on Friday, and it's like blood. I know, it's hard for us modern people to relate to, and it's feels like very primal and archaic. But blood is the sign of the covenant, right? Like a pact forged in blood. And there is this way that the primal substance of life, and Matt reminds us of the sacrifices, and the mezuzah is also a sign of the covenant, right? It's a remembrance of that blood. And so you know, it's like, it doesn't feel as, you know, for us post-Enlightenment people, redemption, or maybe, you know, bitterness and trauma, those are concepts we relate to and understand. But Matt says the Pesach is the actual symbol of Passover. The holiday is called after it, and it's because it, you know, redemption is a bigger phenomenon, but that moment where you put the blood on the door and God acknowledged that and said, I'm not going in, was a moment where a covenant was forged. And this is the sign of the covenant, right? Okay, all right, let me just take a couple of more hands, and then we'll just reflecting on this first, and I'm suggesting kind of least expected of the three, and then I want to pan back a little bit and think about all three of them together. Joel, Ruben.
Yeah, what I was thinking of was that this is happening in the springtime. Spring is a time of rebirth. You do not have a rebirth or a perpetuation of the Jewish people if all of the firstborn are killed. If you get across the Dead Sea or the Red Sea or whatever without the firstborn, it may also be a Pyrrhic victory. So I'm kind of tying it into the significance of spring. If you have no seeds to plant, it's going to be a bitter spring.
Yeah, I think that there's something very sharp and straightforward about your answer, Joel, which is that this is survival. That's what the Pesach represents, is survival. And in this case, the survival of the firstborn, the very thing which had been at the beginning of the story had been taken and killed, right? Like, we are surviving, we are making it through, we are like, that's and so much of what Passover is about is the survival that allows a people to be born and to continue. So themes of reproduction, themes of birth, themes of continuity, like Pesach is about survival, and it's a symbol of the survival because the firstborn survived. Let me take a comment from my mother. Hi. Great. Okay, go. So this is a good transitional thought here. My mother suggests that whatever is happening, you know, with each of these substances, the point is to make you feel like this is current. The reason that we are in touch with these three things is because these experiences, eating the Paschal lamb, eating the matzah, eating the maror, the point of all of those things is to make you feel like this is happening today. Now, that's an interesting comment, what my mother says, because in fact, the next part of the Mishnah, the next piece, where do we go from here, goes exactly where my mother's mind was going. Take a look at this. The Mishnah says that you have to do these three things, gives us reasons, and then goes on to say, in each and every generation, a person must view himself as though he left Egypt. As it is stated, and you shall tell your child on that day, it is because of this which I guess I didn't retranslate this part. It is because of this which the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Okay, so that's exactly what my mom was saying. These substances, says my mom, the point of them is to evoke that feeling of this actually happened to me. And so I want to take my mother's comment and use it to shift now and to begin to think about, we've done a really good job of trying to come up with reasons for that first, I think, most unusual of the three essential parts of the Seder. But let's now pan back and think about the three of them together. What is the reason that we first consider the survival, the sense of being spared, all of the things that we've said, the active nature of our participation in the ceremony, all of the good answers that have been given. Then we move to talking about the redemption itself, matzah, the redemption itself, and then finally consider the bitterness of life in Egypt. Okay, there's a triad there. And it's set up in a certain way. So now let's, like we've exercised our mental muscles a little bit with the first substance, but now let's think about all three. What's happening there in that triad? Why are these the three components that we use to get, my mother says, to get to that sense of it feeling like it's happening right at this moment? Does that make sense? I mean, what other answers might we give to the 1, 2, 3 of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror? Marianka?
I'm thinking of it more as a question, because I'm thinking matzah is called the bread of affliction, and it stands in the middle, and kind of like imagine like a scale where the blood of, it frees us from death, right? The blood, the bitter herbs remind us of the past. And the matzah stands for really two things, because it's the redemption, but it's also affliction, right? Like It has kind of two aspects to it. That's good. Marianka
takes us a little deeper into questioning the matzah, which I called the most obvious of the three. But Marianka's right. It is in some ways the most central substance in Passover. But is it the substance that reminds us of redemption? It's a little funny, actually. Isn't the matzah really about the haste, the not having enough, the bread of affliction? But matzah is the thing that reminds us that we got redeemed? That's an interesting take on it. And Marianka's right. There are lots of ways we could have read the matzah. So Rabban Gamliel is certainly reading it in a very particular way. Richard and then Jen. Richard, if you could unmute yourself.
I always forget. Okay. These three things, it seems to me, are setting up our starting a new life. Number one, we've been in slavery for well over 200 years. We have not been permitted or able to make sacrifices. So the first thing we do in our new life with God is make a sacrifice. The second thing we do is obey orders, a chukat, an unexplainable order of making and eating unleavened bread. And then the third thing is to remember where we came from.
Now, I love what you're doing, Richard, because you're giving us a kind of sequencing, that there's an order to this. Can you say one more word about why in that order? We make the sacrifice, we follow rules, we remember where we came from. And if I could ask it a little differently, why is remembering the bitterness the last thing we do? Wouldn't that be the first thing we do? What's the logic there?
We're reminded of the bitterness at the end so we don't forget it.
Okay. All right. So let's keep thinking along the lines that Richard is thinking. What's the first you tap into the survival? Second, you tap into the redemption. And third, you tap into the bit. Maybe it's too much to say that the order matters. And yet one has to feel that in these very brief teachings, they're intentional about how they present these ideas. Jen?
I wasn't thinking so much about the order, although I know that that's maybe ridiculous because of Seder and Passover, but I was thinking about something that Rabbi Brous once said, which was that, like, retelling the story, it's never just been about what happened to them, it's about what's happening now and to us. And that's why we retell this story, and the trajectory that takes everyone from darkness to light, and from anguish to joy, and from grief to celebration, and from narrowness to expansiveness. I mean, we retell the story because it's built into our DNA. It's what we need to hear, what the rabbis believed we need to hear on a continuous basis every year.
Yeah, great. So I think Jen and my mother and Rabban Gamliel maybe are all kind of on the same page here, which is that there's something about moving through these particular symbols, substances and their symbols, that bring us straight to the next place that the Mishnah goes, right? Presumably, this is still Rabban Gamliel speaking. You do all these things, and then in each and every generation, a person must view themselves as though they left Egypt, right? That's the idea, and it's, we tell this story. What is the purpose of telling the story? The purpose of telling the story is to achieve a state of nowness, of presentness in the. That's what Passover is about, a feeling like it's now. Well, this story is happening to us. Jen, you want to continue?
Yeah, that's basically what I meant, that it's the nowness and it's the survival. We wouldn't be telling the story if we didn't survive, if they didn't survive, if that cycle wasn't continuing. So that's, when you said nowness, I think that, but nowness and like the survival now based on all the survivals previous.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So then in that case, let me ask this question. I have asked so far now a difficult question and a kind of an abstract question. Why this order? And Richard did an admirable job of trying to make some sense of it. That question still hangs in it wide, but that may be we may never like kind of fully wrap that up. But let me introduce another question, given Jen's comments, which is, what is the psychology of eating foods and talking about their meaning that brings us to a state of it feeling real, like it happened to us? In other words, when you eat maror, this feels to me like the most obvious one. When you eat maror, you taste the bitterness of the root and you remember the bitterness of the past, and it's like it's happening to you. Why? What's the mechanism with the food and the symbol and the psychology? Like, how are you getting to that state of, oh yeah, I left Egypt, right? So like, I want to introduce that also, some reflection on these three things as things that we say, but also we say as we eat, and that creates this consciousness for us. Okay, Jen, and then Bob.
Two thoughts, one to that question and one to the kind of related, but to the question of order as well. Multisensory approaches to visualization is absolutely how you bring it into realness in your mind. And that's what we teach nowadays when we're trying to help people visualize something, is smell and taste and sight and sound and sound. That's telling a story in an embodied way is not something that we really culturally do anymore, but we should. would be really nice. In terms of why and what the psychological mechanism is just in general of telling stories, is the best way to develop empathy. They say, like, if you want to help a child learn empathy, read to them, get them to read, have them telling stories to each other. And I'm always thinking about how this story becomes not just about us, but about empathy for the other person. Be just to other strangers because you were a stranger at one point. Offer mercy to other people because mercy was offered to us. So we tell this story and we do it in that order. We leave that bitterness in our mouths so that we'll recognize the bitterness that other people are experiencing too.
Okay, phenomenal. That is a beautiful answer. First of all, let's just repeat the first point that Jen makes, which I think is a very, very smart psychological point, which is that this is a multi-sensory storytelling experience, activates the fullness of us and especially of our bodies. And so we actually do internalize the experience. We actually do, like, the bitterness does go inside of us. And so we're feeling these things, and it's like, there's a psychology there. Like, I'm going to talk about these things, but I'm going to awaken my senses in different ways so that it begins to sink into me. So that is well said about the whole process. But Jen gives us, I think, a very, very strong reason for at least one part of the order, which is that the maror does come last. It's funny because it doesn't come last in the Seder, right? But it's presented last in this teaching, Jen says, because that's actually the point of the whole thing. Like we go through the whole experience and we're redeemed, and wow, that's it, game over. But no, the redemption, and Richard was doing this too, like where do we get to? Where does this take us? Marianka was doing this as well. But Jen says the maror, that last stop, is actually the point of Passover. The point of Passover is to have that whole experience feel like, as my mother said, you're having it right now, so that you're attuned to that experience in the world, right? So that the point of Passover is to become compassionate. That is the point, to be able to feel something that you can see someone else feeling and know that that's not a good feeling. Know that that person also needs to be saved and delivered and redeemed and all of this. That's the point of Passover. And that's why, I go through the whole story and I got out and I'm redeemed. But then at the end, I remember the bitter, not the beginning, which is where I would have started. At the end, because that's the thing that I have to stick with. Remember, people suffer. Remember, I suffered. My people suffered, but actually I suffered. And so I understand what suffering is. That's the whole thing. And it happens in that same sort of sensory way. I love the way you put it, Jen, the taste of the bitterness lingering in our mouths, right? As we leave the Seder table. Beautiful. Bob.
Yeah, so getting back to this question about the order, and as we've been talking, I have been struck that usually with storytelling you start with what comes first and then what comes next, and so the bitterness is what came first. Then there was the blood on the door, and then leaving Egypt. So it seems like Rabbi Gamliel should have said you do it in that order. And as you were saying, Rabbi Kasher, it's even a little bit more how we do it in the Haggadah. But it seems like if he's telling us to retell the story, you want to maybe start with the part that's most hopeful. And it's the part of God intervened, we escaped from Egypt, we were sustained in the desert with the matzah. However, and I think this is maybe a very Jewish concept, you don't want to forget what the context was. Always go back to the history, the memory. It's not like God brought us out of Egypt because he was, I don't know, we got tired there or we needed a new place. There was something very profound, being slaves that needed to be corrected, and the bitterness that was associated with that. So you tell the whole story that's hopeful, but don't forget your past. Don't forget what led up to that.
Great. That's so beautifully put, Bob, that there's we started off talking about storytelling. So there's something we're learning here about the Jewish art of storytelling, which is that it's not linear. It's not necessarily chronological. Right? Bob's right. The bitterness is first in the story. Just take a look. I mean, the Talmud finds the verses actually that all these things are based on, and there's the Passover offering comes from chapter 12 of Exodus. The matzah also from chapter 12, but the bitterness, that's chapter 1. That's where we start, right? That's where we start. And then the plagues, and then we actually leave. That's the story. Tell the story. And I think this is such an important point, because we started by saying, boy, this is a jumbled way to tell a story. The Haggadah does this sort of kind of back and forth and all around way of telling. Is this a good way to tell the story? Well, we can leave that question aside, but what we're learning is the point of the story is not to retell a section of our history. The point of telling this story is to activate a certain kind of consciousness. So we are going to tell the story in a way that brings us into a feeling. This story is being told to summon a certain kind of psychological state within us. And so when we think about the order, it's not A to B to C. It's let's think, how can we kind of get them in this mood and then this mood and then this mood? remember some of the language of the Haggadah is that you begin with gnut, with disgrace, and you end with shevach, you end with praise. There's like a kind of journey that's being mapped internally, not just in the historical record. Okay, so this is good. I think we're saying some very foundational things about what it means to tell this story. Okay, I see we're almost done here. I see 2 hands. Richard, is this from before? Your hand up? Okay, I assume it is. And Yonatan, I think you have a hand up again.
Yes, I just want to acknowledge that the rabbis are walking a really fine line here. They want us to experience a bit of suffering for the sake of empathy, but they're not really, like, Judaism is not a religion that allows us to hurt ourselves, right? And that's never their goal. So there's something really miraculous to me about this vessel itself, this vessel of the maror and the matzah, that is, here's a small little way that you can capture pain and inconvenience, but you're really called upon to imagine that it's much greater than it is, because you're not going to, enslave one another. You're not going to exsanguinate yourself the way that some other religions might, or what have you. There's a lot packed into a tiny little herb.
Yeah, that's very well said, Yonatan. That's very well said, right? Because I love where we've gotten. It really, in some ways, feels like maror is the culmination, right? Maror, I mean, following Jen's lead here, maror really is like, it's that empathetic position that we're like striving for. Yonatan says something I think so simple and yet profound, which is that we don't put ourselves into slavery, right? We don't actually suffer that much. How much? Okay, we want to get into that consciousness. So our ancestors were slaves, so we eat some bitter stuff. I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a Seder where you eat like the raw bitter herb. My father used to shave this out, and then you'd eat it, and people would like be crying and nearly puking at the Seder. And okay, that's intense, but it's not slavery, right? And there is as Yonatan put, a kind of a fine line here where it's like, I want you to feel enough suffering that awakens you. I don't want your life to be bad, though. You're redeemed, you're free. But maybe this substance will kind of just be bitter enough that it's just unpleasant enough that you're able to kick up that historical consciousness, that sort of that collective memory enough so that you can get into it without having to be slaves again yourselves, right? Or at least that's the goal, right? Okay, beautiful. I just will. I think we've really gotten somewhere here, although nowhere official. I mean, we could continue to, and we should continue to play around with these symbols and think about what is the meaning of each of these symbols. And maybe some of you out there have a different take on which of the three is the critical symbol, or how exactly the journey moves from one to the other. But that's the point. We keep telling this and talking about it every year. But at least I think what we've done together by looking at Rabban Gamliel's teaching is to understand that there are some core themes here. There are some core moments, there are some core experiences, there are some core principles that we are searching for when we sit down and begin to tell the story. It isn't just, can I remember what happened in chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, chapter 2, chapter 3, right? It isn't just a telling of a narrative. It's a kind of searching for the IKAR, the essence, the key. What is at the heart of this all? And why do we keep telling this story? What is it meant to produce in us, right? And, I'll say it again. I think, my mother anticipated, if we're to trust Rabban Gamliel, what it's meant to do for us is to bring us to this state where we see ourselves as having gone through an experience. We actually, somehow it feels like it's it's happened to us. And the way that we do that is by telling a story, but we tell a story in a particular way, and we do it with particular substances. We're trying to activate our minds. We're trying to spark a certain kind of consciousness that, you know, I mean, I guess I'll just end. I think Jen said it so powerfully, so I'll end there. We're supposed to get to that maror place. Right? We're supposed to get to that place of, oh, I went through all of this and I survived. Miraculously, I survived, and I'm free. So what? So I have to get back to that feeling. And in some ways, I'm thinking now about Bob's comments. In some ways, it's like, that's the hardest thing of all, is going back to the beginning of the story. I have to get all the way back to chapter 1. I have to remember the thing that was at the core of this all, which is that we suffered unjustly. And it's so easy to forget that when you're free again. That's the thing that we have to get back to. That's the thing that we have to figure out how to feel again. And these substances and this storytelling is our way of doing that. So I wish everybody a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Really great learning with you all. It's definitely, you've made my upcoming Seder a better one, and I hope that's true for everybody here. Chag Sameach. We have a whole week of learning. Rabbi Brous is teaching a class on Passover as the holiday of justice tomorrow at 6. I'll be teaching a class on poetry as a form of liberation Wednesday at 6. Hillel's teaching the music of Passover Wednesday at 8. And I'll be teaching a class on Passover in the Parsha Thursday at 12. So just if you want to get into that consciousness, keep learning with us, okay? Love you all.